It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. Take Command podcast. I'm Craig Hoffman. That is Logan Paulsen. And Logan, today we are going to take a look at where this roster is post NFL draft. We have been talking a lot throughout the NFL draft process about what we think this draft could teach us and what some of these free agent signings, obviously before that, teach us about the remaining incumbent players and how Dan Quinn and his staff might see some of these guys, what roles they could ultimately inhabit in 2024. And so now that we have all those pieces in place, I think it'd be good to circle around and kind of look at each. We're going to go through the entire team by position group and be like, okay, what do we got here? And who do we see being impact players in 2024? Sound good to you?
It sounds great, man. Sounds great.
All right, let's do it then. And let's start with quarterback, because when do we not start with quarterback? Obviously, Jayden Daniels, for whatever it's worth, ESPN.com has him number one on the depth chart over Marcus Mariota. He's going to have to win the job. And it's really, in some ways, it's like last year where he's going to have to just come in and prove that he's ready. And as long as he's ready, a la Sam Howell proved that he was ready, he'll be QB1 when they open the season. If they think that he needs a little bit more time, he's just not adapting to the offense like they want, doesn't have the command of it, the speed is too much for him, whatever, they'll start Marcus Mariota. But I just real quickly, quarterback and Jayden has been so much of the focus of the offseason. Now that he's actually here, what do you think he's got to prove in the spring to ensure that he actually is QB1? And how do you think that they'll divvy up the reps when they go through the OTAs and minicamps?
Well, I think this thing is multifactorial in a way that it hasn't been since I've been covering the team. And what I mean by that is obviously you have a new offensive coordinator, you have a new backup quarterback in Marcus Mariota, and you have a new, potential starter. Obviously, like you said, he's got to earn that position, all those different things. But I think the most compelling thing about the quarterback position is what does the offense look like with him at the helm? And that's something that I'm kind of frothing at the bit to see here in terms of what they end up doing. Does it have a lot of RPO? Does it have more zone read? Is it more of a vertical based passing attack? We've talked about this a lot, after watching a lot of Cliff stuff in 2021, there's a big element to that. So just as a starting point, what does that look like? And then if there's a big kind of West Coast emphasis, I do think it'll take some time for him to adjust, because one of the things about watching the stuff at LSU is it was very vertical, it was very simplistic, and they just made it work because they got great execution from Jayden Daniels and the offensive skill players that they had there, Malik Neighbors and Brian Thomas Jr. So I'm just curious to see how he handles there will be more on his plate, right? He's known to be a great studier. So that whole process will be really interesting. But I do think this is it's not it's, to me, you said you made the comparison to last year, and I think it's a good comparison. I just think this is more so it's going to be Jayden than it was, last year felt like at least they kind of put on the illusion of saying, oh, it's going to be Jacoby or Sam. We all kind of knew they were favoring Sam a little bit, but I think we can just tell based on draft position and how they talk about this kid, it's going to favor him at some point. And I would expect him to be the starter kind of going into week one of the season. Now, that may not happen if he's really not ready, but I do think you're just looking can he handle the progressions? Can he handle the reads? Can he handle the protection responsibilities? Obviously, that's why you bring in Tyler Biadasz to kind of handle some of that responsibility. But all indications from watching his film and talking with people, I think he'll be ready, based on the kid. But I do think the more compelling issue is what does the offense look like and how do they build it around him, and I think that's the kind of something I'm going to be keeping an eye on, obviously, with regards to the quarterback situation.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that Marcus Mariota can run that version of the offense. It might be best suited to run that version of the offense as well. So it's not like they got to create multiple offenses here. I think I would, if I were them, I would basically give Jayden the spring to get ready to be ready, if that makes sense. AKA, I would give him the 1 reps. I would give him, A, the first team reps, B, the most reps. And if by the end of the spring you've got real concerns, well, then you use training camp to get Mariota ready for the season, because he's going to be the one starting the season. And maybe it's a more of a split reps than your traditional 1-2. You don't have to do it, exactly one kind of way. But at the end of the day, if Jaden, for whatever reason, is not ready, and I tend to agree with you, like they've already got the VR stuff, which they were going to get anyway, but especially once they knew it was him, like they've got the stuff that he needs to study in the way that has been incredibly successful for him. This is not to say that I don't think he's going to be ready, because I do agree with you. I think by week 1, like, he's your guy. But just in case, like, training camp then has to become about getting the football team ready to play. It's not just a pure Jaden Daniels experiment. And so by giving him all these reps in the spring, you give him the opportunity. And Marcus has been around the league long enough to be able to learn and be able to do it without some of the reps, which is part of the reason you bring a guy like that in. And so I think that's kind of the lay of the land of the quarterback position. Obviously, the back end is also interesting. You bring in Jeff Driscoll. You also bring in Sam Hartman. And then Jake Fromm's in-house. One of those 3 is going to survive. I would imagine Fromm or... I guess with the new practice squad rules, Driscoll hadn't played that much. He can probably, like, all 3 of them might be able to wind up being on practice squad in terms of eligibility. I would imagine they keep 1 or 2 of them. Hartman getting the significant signing bonus money, unless he's just way out of his depth. I'd imagine he's one of them. So going to be interesting to see what they do. I would imagine Driscoll and Hartman are the 2 that stick around. But ultimately, Fromm, was impressed a lot of people last year in the way he handled his business. So that's kind of the quarterback position. Running back, you got Austin Eckler coming in as the big flashy name. Brian Robinson, the lesser known incumbent, but I think at this point in their careers, Robinson might just be the better player. But those 2 are definitely going to split. Chris Rodriguez has shown quite a bit. And then they also brought in Jerry McNichols, who you played with actually in San Francisco, to kind of round out that room. I don't know how much there is to talk about here. I think you're going to have kind of your traditional 1-2-3 running back split here, with Robinson being the workhorse, Eckler having a lot of responsibility, and then Rodriguez being able to spell either of them. But especially kind of those power, you might give him a series, a half, and just be like, hey, go run as hard as you can. But we'll see. Anything more to really add to this running back position?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing we're going to be talking about with every position, much like the quarterback spot. Obviously, the quarterback spot seems to be, painted a little bit more clearly. There's offensive implications and all that kind of stuff. I do think there's going to be a usage, just kind of like what they want from the back position. I think there's an assumption that, hey, it's going to be B-Rob and, Austin Eckler splitting reps. But I do think you bring in McNichols here because you think that he brings like some third down pass catching ability. I think when you look at the UDFAs they brought in, they're all kind of third down type body types. And, when you look at, what they did at LSU, when you look at kind of Cliff's background in terms of quarterback development, like you need to be able to pass protect at the running back position, and you need to bring good value in the pass game in terms of upside. So I think that, we're kind of operating under the assumption it's going to be a very traditional, kind of offensive philosophy. But I do think like that third down role that Austin Eckler is probably going to take over is going to be huge in this offense. And especially with a young quarterback, it's going to be exceptionally critical. So I could see a world where, hypothetically B-Rob, has not been super efficient as a pass protector, and his usage pattern changes pretty dramatically because maybe they're prioritizing. And again, that's the fun part about this offseason with the new offensive coordinator. Maybe they're prioritizing, and I have no insight on this. I'm just saying, maybe you're prioritizing like that third down pass protecting role. And, Chris Rodriguez is a little bit better pass protector than B-Rob. So maybe that kind of shifts the power dynamic. And I think B-Rob's an excellent player and needs to be on the field. But that's one thing that I think is going to be so exciting about this offseason is, what does this offense look like? What are they prioritizing? What's the archetype in Cliff Kingsbury's mind for each position? Because when you look at Arizona, they have Connor, who's this big kind of very similar to B-Rob kind of back, but then you also have these like little scat backs that are great in pass protection and great on third down. So like there's going to be this very interesting kind of allocation of roles here, and I really can't wait to see it shake out. But I think more so than any other year, like that depth chart as it's laid out is so in flux. Like I've been a part of multiple staffs that have come in, and that you might as well just throw that depth chart out the window because they're going to pick who they like. And Dan has made that very clear. They want the best players to play. They want the best players to play for their system to play. And so I just want to kind of put that expectation out there. Like, I think B-Rob's excellent. I think, Rodriguez is excellent. I think Austin Eckler is excellent. But you never know in terms of rep allocation who's going to kind of embody the vision for the offense the best at the position.
Totally. And, I'm glad you brought up the James Conner thing, because we can talk about all these other things that backs have to do, but the number one responsibility is like, can you run the football effectively? Especially if they're going to lean heavy into that running game. And it seems like that could definitely be a plan. You hear, like, I think Keim had some of that in the story he wrote over the weekend on ESPN.com about kind of their plan for Jaden and, how they plan on bringing him along. And it's like, okay, well then Brian Robinson is probably the best runner of that group, and especially in the kind of one cut style that they had in that final year in Arizona, where B-Rob has been compared to James Conner as a runner. So I think that's definitely going to be really interesting to watch, because also you have Anthony Lynn here as the run game coordinator, and he spent last year with Kyle in San Francisco. So do they run that similar run scheme that Cliff ran at the end of his time in Arizona, or are they going to go to more of a zone type of scheme, marry the play action to it a little bit more, and then take some of the elements of Cliff's offense, but is Cliff kind of going to create this amalgamation of offenses, and what backs ultimately fit that? Like, it is the fascinating question, but they've got options, which I think is fun. Receiver is one where I think we learned something in the draft about kind of what they have in house and what they think of it, because they could have gone big X receiver, kind of slid everybody over a spot, moved Terry to the Z, put Jahan in the slot, and then, filled out the rest of the roster from there. Instead, they draft a slot receiver in Luke McCaffrey. It seems like Terry's going to stay outside at X, and obviously Terry's been very successful there. Jahan, I think they see as an outside guy, although I'm sure there'll be some versatility within the offense. But I think there's also some other names that they've brought in / were in-house that are worth mentioning. Obviously, the guy they bring in is Olamide Zaccheaus, who has had some really nice years as kind of a down the depth chart receiver with Atlanta, amongst others. So, like, he's a real NFL player. He's not like a guy that I'm like, yes, he's my third receiver, but as a 4 or a 5, cool. Obviously, Diami's still here. In a vertical passing game, he's theoretically a threat. But he's actually a guy that I think has been more successful in the NFL as like a special teamer and a run blocker. Who has the threat of vertical speed, which is a valuable piece. Like, hey, if we're going to run the football, Diami can play, and if we go on play action and try to hit a shot, like, he's a threat. Jamison Crowder they brought back, who had some nice time in the slot last year as kind of the smaller body type slot versus Luke McCaffrey. And then one other guy that I want to mention real quick, Logan, is Kaz Allen, who they kept from last year. Bryson Tremaine's still around too, but Kaz is a guy that they immediately put on a futures contract after the season and committed to being on the 90-man roster for the offseason. And so when we think both about special teams and punt returner and the new kick return rules, that's kind of why he was brought in as a UDFA last year. But if he's developed last year on the practice squad and ultimately is ready to play some offensive snaps this year, that's kind of that him and Crowder seem to be battling it out for one spot, that smaller receiver body type / punt returner to pair with McCaffrey as the bigger slot that they take in the draft.
Yeah, and I think this group might be the most compelling, in terms, obviously the top 3. And a receiver every year is really fun to kind of watch, I think, and kind of be, keep track of because there is so much flexibility. But I think, like you hit the nail on the head, I think it's going to be Terry, Jahan, and then I think Luke and probably Zaccheaus are competing for that kind of big slot role. And I do think, again, this comes down to offensive vision and what you're thinking here in terms of which one of those guys probably gets more snaps. But I think everybody else, to me, is up for kind of like putting in their resume a little bit here. Dax Milne, Diami Brown, Mitchell Tinsley, Bryson Tremaine, all these guys are going to have to carve a role. So I look at kind of who are the best special teams players of this group. You mentioned Kaz Allen. I don't know if that return ability is enough to keep him around, especially because I think Luke McCaffrey has some return ability. I think Zaccheaus has some return ability, and obviously Jamison Crowder has return ability, so I'm not sure that's enough to keep him on the roster. So again, this group every year, the fireworks are going to start when they start at training camp, or when they start during OTA work, OTA's mini camp, training camp, preseason, because people are that this is a group that is definitely outside of those top 3 guys, top 4 guys are definitely fighting for spots. And Bryson Tremaine's a guy that I liked last year, watching quite a bit, and he's got the size that everyone's looking for. Maybe he could be kind of a big slot piece, but then you kind of juxtapose that with the tight ends, and you say, well, you got Cole Turner, you got Armani Rogers, you got Zach Ertz, you've got these guys that can kind of line up as big slots and kind of create mismatches that way. Maybe they look as an offensive vision, they say, man, we want to shift more to that kind of body type in that position. And then a guy like Bryson Tremaine is out, or, whatever it may be. So I do think that this group, even after the draft, like it's solidified to a certain extent. But again, because we're not really sure exactly what they're looking for at the position, like to me, it comes down to special teams value add. And then when you look at it from that standpoint, the kid from Georgia that they brought in, Marcus Rosemy-Jacksaint, is a guy that played great special teams at Georgia, had a nice Senior Bowl. There are some injury concerns from him from a draft standpoint, but maybe he makes some waves there as like a gunner or a vice guy, especially with the new special teams rules and kind of the emphasis on the kickoff. So to me, this group, the top three are the top three, top four. We'll throw another person in there, but everybody else, it's like, what is your special teams value and what is your role in the new offense in a way that is very different than any other position on the roster?
Do you think with the new kickoff rule and special teams being so important this year that changes how coaches approach training camp in terms of number of special teams periods, how they conduct their special teams periods? Because there's such an evaluation on that. Or is that still going to come down to drilling your special team stuff and then ultimately, in preseason games, seeing who can make plays and who executes the way that you want to?
I think that's exactly right. One thing I've noticed is that even though special teams has become less emphasized in the NFL, in practice it's still treated the same way. Like when I was playing the NFL, there was this number of special teams period. When I go watch the Commanders practice, it's still the same thing. You know what I'm saying? So it's always been a point of emphasis. But I do think in terms of roster selection, it becomes more important. It becomes like it was when I first got in the league in 2010. Like those 3-4 top receivers are all going to play receiver, but everybody after that, you have to add value as a teams player. Like you have to. And I think that's kind of what you're going to get here. And so the type of guys you're going to see stay on the roster are going to be a little bit different. Like just as an example, like Dax, for example, is a guy that was a really good receiver that they were trying to find a role for on teams. I think now that's going to kind of flip on its head a little bit. You're going to find guys who are really good teams player that they're trying to find roles for offensively. So I think that's going to be the difference in terms of how they kind of treat that relationship.
Last thing on the receivers, the kind of difference between the big slots and the shifty slots, the traditional slots, if you will, the Crowders and the Kaz Allens, those guys versus like a Luke McCaffrey. Like, what's the value of having both? And also what are we looking for during minicamp, training camp, et cetera, as we try to determine what Cliff is looking for out of his 4th, 5th, 6th receiver?
Well, I think the selection of McCaffrey kind of points you in a direction. I think even the selection of the bringing in a guy like Zacchaeus points you in a direction too. And like body type wise, they're a little bit different, but they play in a very similar way. So I got to play with Zacchaeus when he was a rookie in Atlanta. And Zacchaeus is a physical guy. He's not a big guy, but he's physical. He's not afraid.
5'8", 195.
Yeah, he's well put together. He'll block. He'll make tough contested catches over the middle. He's willing to do some stuff in the run game that most receivers aren't able to do, and able to catch the football. And I think when you look at Luke McCaffrey, it's almost that exact same thing. And so what I'm looking at here, just the landscape, is I think they're going to kind of potentially shift away from that super small, shifty guy in the slot. And because you have Jahan on the roster, like if I want a super small, shifty guy in the slot, I can put Jahan out there and let him make a play for me. I can formation it so he's that guy. But in terms of attitude, I just look at again, a perfect example is Puka Nacua for the LA Rams, or Michael Jennings in San Francisco, the slot receiver there who converted quarterback from Tennessee. They are guys that are awesome because they make it so hard for defenses to key in on personnel. And so what I mean by that is when you have a big slot like Luke McCaffrey, hypothetically, I think this is the role they see for him, is I can get to a lot of my 12 personnel runs because I've got a receiver that's physical enough to do the stuff that like a move tight end will do. Now, he's not going to do it as well as that move tight end, but from a personnel matchup standpoint, that's what I get. And I think that's what you're looking at. Like what I come out of the draft thinking is like, that is a big priority for this team. So in terms of selecting that third receiver, that fourth receiver, you definitely need guys who can do that, which is another reason why like the Bryson Tremaine thing kind of comes up to me, because like when you look at his play style, I mean, he spits nails, man. Like he's very physical as a gunner. He's going to get after you in the run game. Like I think that, and then that's how a guy like that would carve a role. Basically, I'm your second or third big slot guy because I'm willing to put my face on people and make these tough plays that other people aren't able to make. But then again, like it goes back to the tight end relationship too. Maybe you see some of those bigger body guys like Armani or Cole in that same way. So that's, I think, what you're getting out of that position, which I think is the way the position should be going. And I think that's the way you should be selecting the position. But I also think because of the flexibility of those first two guys, Jahan specifically, I can be more flexible with my roster. I don't have to keep, Kaz Allen as an example, because I have a guy who can get that stuff done for me in the slot. And I think to defend Luke here, I think Luke also can develop in that role as a route runner as well. So I think that's what the direction I think they're going to go with that slot position, just based on the decisions they made at the receiver spot. And then also when you look at the tight end position with the signing of Ben Sinnott, like they're looking for flexibility and things that make it hard for defenses to match personnel. So that's, in terms of anticipating what to expect going into OTAs, going into minicamp, and what the reporting is going to be out of it, that's what I would expect to see from that group.
That brings us to the tight end group and Ben Sinnott, obviously behind Zach Ertz. You got John Bates, you got Cole Turner, you got Armani Rogers as well. This is also going to become, and we're way too early to get into this with any meaningfulness, but this is also going to become interesting of our numbers game. Like, do they keep 4 running backs? Do they keep 6 receivers? Do they keep 4 tight ends? Like, what do they do there? I feel like 4 tight ends is very possible, especially with Sinnott being, is he a fullback? Is he a tight end? Is he and Ertz, like kind of a quasi wide receiver at this point in his career. Like there's just a lot of guys that have that positional crossover that you're going to use in those spots. So the days of when I was covering Jay and he had 7 receivers that he'd keep, like that feels unlikely. But then again, we say that every year, and then there's 8 receivers that we want to keep. So that's going to be a fun August podcast for us well down the line. As for right now, Ertz, Sinnott, Bates, Turner, Rogers. I really feel like the top 3 should be kind of locked in, and then it's a matter of can Cole Turner or Armani Rogers make a case for number 4, but what do you see?
No, I think I see it the same way. And again, it kind of goes back to that big slot role and how you feel about those guys, because like, for example, Cole in college played basically receiver, like he was basically like a big wideout that would line up attached sometimes, would line up in the slot. And when I think about his body in the big slot role, like it kind of fits his skill set better. So maybe you say, oh man, maybe we could keep an extra tight end, but he's really a receiver. You know what I'm saying? So again, that'll be interesting to see how they kind of make those decisions there. Obviously, I think the drafting of Luke McCaffrey makes that a little less likely, but it's not outside the realm of possibility. But I do agree. I think it comes down to you've got your 3. I think, Bates obviously is the blocking Y, which is going to have a role in this offense. Zach is kind of that big slot piece. And then I think Ben Sinnott as that fullback guy that can kind of back up Zach in a pinch if you need to. And then I think you keep the next best guy out of that. And I think after watching Armani 2 years ago before the Achilles tear, like he would be the guy from an athletic profile standpoint. Like talk about a flexible piece. Like he's physical, he's snappy in line. Again, we have to see how he looks coming off the injury, but he also ran like a receiver, and I think like there is a lot of value for a coach like Cliff and for a staff that Cliff has kind of accumulated here. And we've talked about the importance of some of these selections in terms of flexibility, right? Ben Sinnott, Luke McCaffrey, that piece that could line up out wide, win a one-on-one, do that stuff for you, and also do some stuff in line seems like the right fit, but obviously he's got to be healthy. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, I'm kind of trying to check my bias here because, you're the same way. We're so fond of what they do in San Francisco with, all these different guys with Kittle, with Debo, with McCaffrey, their McCaffrey, all those different guys that they move around, and like the versatility, and like, are we just seeing the possibilities here and putting something on Cliff that he's not actually doing? But it does feel like that is in his wheelhouse, and both from a creative standpoint and some of the things he has done in the past, that there will be this kind of positional versatility. And, we know that Dan believes in this as well.
Right.
Dan has spent some time with NBA coaches talking about positionless basketball, and how do you take some of those concepts and ideas and principles and apply them to football, offensively and defensively. And we'll talk about that when we get to the DBs and the linebackers as well, maybe even the D-line. So it's going to be interesting to see how they deploy all these guys. And the one thing I'll just say about Sinnott real quick too, and talking to some more folks who covered him in college, like, he's a really good pass catching tight end as well. It's not just like he's
right.
a smash your face fullback type.
No,
like, he's not
no.
Mike Allstott reincarnated by any stretch. He's a guy that can get out there and run routes and like route people up, and got good hands, and he's fast. And so it is going to be fun to kind of watch him move around, not just as a move tight end, but can you go then line him up outside and get a linebacker one-on-one in space? And some of the Cliff 3x1 stuff, like, is he the one out there? Because all of a sudden they get man coverage, and it's a one-on-one in a ton of space for Ben Sinnott. So there's so many options for Cliff, and obviously pairing that down into your most effective stuff is kind of Cliff and Land and everybody's job here. But it's just worth pointing out on Sinnott that, like, he's not just going to line up as a fullback. He will,
No.
but there's a lot more to it. In the same way that San Francisco does use Kyle Juszczyk and line him up all over the place. Anything else you want to add there before we get to O-line?
Yeah, and I just think, like, one of the reasons I'm making this assertion about some of this positional flexibility is because, like, that's what you're seeing around the league right now. And I think, to Cliff's credit, he's done a really good job of adapting to what the league is presenting and seeing value. And, I remember in one of his first press conferences, an interview that I did with him for the Commanders, he was just like, we're looking for matchups. And you don't get that unless you have people like this. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's the thing I just keep coming back to is, like, you get a Ben Sinnott, and, like, hell yeah, like, he's a good athlete. He has a 40-inch vertical. He ran a 4.6 whatever at the combine, but it works for him because that's not an elite athletic profile. It's very good for a tight end, but it's not elite. It works for him because he can block, right? Luke McCaffrey draws a good matchup because defensively you have to say, shoot, we have to match in Buffalo nickel because this guy can actually block too. And then Luke McCaffrey matched up on a Buffalo nickel as opposed to a true nickel. That's where the matchup advantage comes. And you mentioned the 3x1 stuff with Ben Sinnott. Like, he's going to draw a linebacker because that's what Kyle Juszczyk gets, right? And people are starting to get wise to that playing San Francisco, saying we can't do that. But that's another reason why San Fran can run the football. So that's what this gives you, right? I hopefully I didn't make it like that these guys are just blocking pieces, but it's the blocking physicality that gives you the offensive flexibility for good matchups. And I think that's the thing, even with guys like Armani, with Bryson Tremaine, like that is intriguing because they kind of seem to fit this physicality mold that allows you a good matchup.
Yeah, they fit the ethos. Offensive line.
This is interesting too, man. It's crazy.
Yeah. So right now, the projected starters, I would say, are Coleman at left tackle, Allegretti at left guard, Biotish at center, Cosmi right guard, Wiley right tackle. Then you got Cornelius Lucas floating around as a potential starter at tackle. Chris Paul is going to want to fight for that left guard spot. We'll see. They brought in Michael Dieter as a backup center. Mason Brooks still on the roster from last year. Trent Scott's been mentioned as a backup tackle in there. Then you got Braden Daniels, was a 4th-round pick last year. Might have not supposed to have been, but like he's a guy that would have been drafted last year. What can this group get out of him? Ricky Stromberg, a 3rd-rounder last year. Like, what happens to him? Who showed some flashes. And then you got a couple other guys, Akinbulu and Good Jones, on the roster as well. But that's 10 offensive linemen that are intriguing for one reason or another, or at the very least, like in Dieter's case, like I don't know how intriguing he is, other than like he's probably going to make the team, or is going to fight to make the team as a backup interior swing guy. But a lot of intriguing, some high upside, like younger guys, and then obviously the big question at left tackle with Coleman is like, can he play it and is he ready? seems like we should be talking about him as a tackle, or we should have been talking about him as a tackle all along. And we almost did him a disservice because he played some guard in a pinch for TCU this year. But that doesn't mean you can necessarily like play left tackle at the NFL level. So plenty of intrigue. What's the most interesting headline, if you will, from your seat?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I had to kind of give a narrative, I think it's like you probably feel good at your right tackle, right guard, right, or, center position because of how you've allocated money to those positions. And then I think you bring up a good point. Like left guard feels like, I know they brought Nick Allegretti in and I expect him to kind of get the first crack at it. But then I think because of the Mason Brooks, the Ricky Strombergs, the Chris Pauls, like I think there's going to be healthy competition at that spot. Even Braden Daniels I'd probably throw in there. So I think that's kind of a 5-man gateway there in terms of potential starting. And then you said Brandon Coleman might start. I think Cornelius Lucas, I would pencil in as the starter probably right now. I think he'll probably get the first crack at the position because I think when I don't remember, I should have looked this up before we did this podcast. That's poor work ethic on my part, but I think he started versus San Francisco last year, or he played a little bit versus San Francisco. And so I think they've seen him play. And I think when you look at how he handles his pass protection responsibilities, Corn does a pretty good job. Now, he's not always the most physical guy in the run game. He's got some limitations, but I think his length give people problems. Like when you talk to rushers around the league, like they talk about Corn as being difficult to deal with. Guys that have worked with him that I know very well, speak very highly of him. So I do think he'll probably get the first crack. And then I think Brandon Coleman and him will be in a competition because, as much as like you said we did him a disservice, the NFL on the whole, in terms of people that I talked with, had Brandon Coleman projecting to guard. So again, I think there is a pathway and physical traits and length that says he can play left tackle, but that is a possibility. It's also that he ends up playing guard. So right now, I would say Lucas is the guy at left, and then it's a competition at left guard with Allegretti getting the first crack, and then we got to see where Coleman feels most comfortable. And again, I think Coleman will play on this offensive line, whether at guard or tackle, because I think he's that good. It's just about finding the home for him, much like the previous staff did with Sam Cosmi.
Excellently timed. Speaking there, Logan, right as you got done, I was able to get the box score from PFF last year, the grades from PFF from the San Francisco game, and Cornelius Lucas did indeed play left tackle, and he graded out very well. Yes. He graded us out at a 73, 86 as a pass blocker. 58 in the run game. So yeah, he definitely was asked to do quite a bit, 32 pass blocking snaps, and graded out very, very well in that game. So as you said, got to be seen by Adam Peters up close and personal. And so I also think obviously it gives Coleman time. Like at the very least, it gives Coleman time if they want to try him out at tackle. But it does, if all of a sudden they get him there and it's like, oh my God, he's not a tackle, he's a guard at the NFL level. Now all of a sudden is he in the mix with Allegretti? Like it does become very interesting, but then you're also very thin at tackle. And so this is the one position where I still do feel like there could be another addition. And whether it's, everyone always wants to talk about Bakhtiari because he's the biggest name on the market. Andres Pete's still out there.
More of a guard, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see.
But to your point, I think like if there's a guy that and I think one of the things you appreciate about the staff so far is that they've found the right guys for them. So maybe it's not Bakhtiari, maybe it's the swing tackle from wherever, and from, let's say, Buffalo, hypothetically, and he becomes the left tackle. Like they've done a good job of identifying talent and bringing the right kind of guys in. So I don't think it'll be like a top of the market guy. I think it'll be someone with some upside play that just adds some depth to that position. And, they might think of Braden Daniels as a tackle. I don't believe that to be true. I have no inside information on that, but they might think they're in a better spot there. Scott had a good year last year in terms of when he had to fill in and play. So maybe they think, hey, we're doing all right here. And if we're going to prioritize running the football, again, much like the quarterback, you can deleverage that group. I think last year with Eric Bieniemy, we saw kind of the most intense version of like stressing the offensive line in recent years. There's when you watch San Francisco or when you watch LA, when you watch Green Bay, even Miami to a certain extent, they do a great job of saying, hey, like our group is good, but they're not the best. How do we make sure that this is an easy game for them? And I think that's going to be a priority based on stuff that John Keim has said, based on stuff that Cliff's alluded to. So that's something I would also say, like, while it seems like we're a little bit naked at the offensive line in terms of depth at the tackle position, I think if you handle this correctly, you can really limit that guy's exposure and put the whole group in a better spot. And again, it comes back to the play caller with Cliff.
Yeah, it's funny because I have seen some commentary post-draft about Miami and San Francisco specifically, where some analysts have basically been like, I guess Mike and Kyle just think they can scheme around the offensive line, and they might be right. And if they are right, what does that mean for the NFL? But like that's kind of seems to be the approach. D-line for the Commanders is definitely interesting. They're a little bit overloaded in some spots where, like, I've actually thought about this as we've done this exercise here. There's going to be there's just not enough room on the 53 for all these dudes.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be some guys that wind up getting cut that people are going to be surprised by. And so D-line is one of those spots where you just wonder, is there a surprise cut or a guy like, and the guy that I've kind of looking at, unfortunately for him, is Fedarian Mathis. Like, is there a spot for him, depending on how some other guys play? Obviously, on the edges, you have Dante Fowler, Cleveland Farrell, KJ Henry, F.A. Obata, Dorrance Armstrong, and then some younger guys, Josh Pryor, Andre Jones, on down the list. And then inside, Payne Allen, Johnny Newton, second rounder, John Ridgway, who Dan Quinn initially drafted in Dallas, and then Big Phil and a couple of other guys that are floating around, UDFA's, younger players that have been around, like Benning, Patoe, etc. So this is one where I'm like, how deep do they go? Do they keep 9? Do they keep 10? How much of that is inside, outside, with some of the flexibility of some of these guys to play, like an F.A. Obata to play inside and outside? It's going to be interesting to watch this battle throughout camp and see what they prioritize. Especially, last thing I'll add, Logan, is when you've got guys like Frankie Louvu floating around the linebacker position who are probably going to take some reps on the edge. That's a sub package that could infiltrate the decision making of this group.
Well, I think that's great analysis, and it feels to me a lot like the wide receiver group, in the sense that you've got kind of your 4 starting guys, and then it comes down to kind of stylistically like what you're looking for. I've been around the building, and you get to see KJ Henry and Andre Jones and F.A. Obata up close and personal, and those guys are pretty freaky. And then they bring Jean-Baptiste into the mix, who's also a big, tall, freaky guy. Couple that with Dante Fowler Jr., and it really just, to me, comes down to like who of that group can kind of separate themselves and say, I deserve to be the 4th, 5th defensive end edge rusher rotational guy, because they all have the traits. It just depends on, like, again, kind of what they're looking for. Because I think about Dan and like what he's been successful with over the course of his career, and it's a lot of big traitsy edge rushers. And usually, like on a roster, like when you were in Atlanta, you could be like, this guy is the big traitsy guy, like he'll be here. But the crazy thing is they're all kind of big traitsy guys, and so it's just kind of who's most productive in those situations. I think the defensive tackle thing is also really interesting because, there's no investment there, and I think like, what are you looking for in those spots? Obviously, I think Jerzon will be here kind of no matter what. And then it's like, who else is filling in? Are you looking for kind of that hard-nosed run stuffer that Ridgway is, or are you kind of hoping Big Phil finds his legs? And, I've been a part of teams where a coaching change does wonders for a player, and talking with guys about the coaching and development philosophy here over the last couple of years, they don't paint a pretty picture. So maybe get some new coaches in here, guys with a better developmental philosophy, a clearer vision of the defense, and you get significantly better production from a guy like Phil or a guy like John. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, well, we're doing okay. And he does make the team. So I think that'll be really interesting. But in terms of a group that's going to be really compelling to watch, I think the receivers are going to be compelling. The receivers and tight ends, those offensive pass catchers, are going to be compelling on offense. And I think this defensive line group, coupled with the linebackers, because you mentioned Frankie Louvu and what he brings as a pass rusher, like how does he fit in that mix as well? So again, really kind of a interesting group, because a lot of guys with traits and physicality that have not been overly productive that are on the roster right now. Obviously, they bring in Armstrong, they bring in Fowler, guys that have been more productive in their careers, and just like, who do they end up settling on ultimately, which I think is going to be very, very interesting. So,
yeah, no doubt. There's just, it's almost like paralysis by options here, because you've also got to decide, if you're them, like, how are we splitting up these reps in camp? Like, how are we going to even go about making this decision? How about giving ourselves the information? Surely they have some kind of plan. Like, they're professional coaches. It's what they do. But if you're,
sure
if you're F.A. Obata and you're like fourth string, you're like, good, great. Like, oh man. But it's also a position where they rotate a lot more. So, even if you're fourth string, you look at yourself as like second string almost by the time you get the rotation going and guys are getting out. There's certain guys, like Dan Quinn doesn't need to see Dante Fowler. Dan Quinn has seen Dante Fowler for Dante Fowler's entire career. And so there's a chance to sit him out some extra reps. He's a vet. He doesn't need them as much. He's been around this group. And so, guys like FA maybe who are newer to this coaching staff and maybe a little bit farther down the depth chart get a chance to prove themselves. And I again, like, how you do stuff in the spring is not necessarily how you're going to do it in August. And this springtime can be really, really good for some of that initial evaluation of how you kind of want to set your depth chart going into the fall. Linebacker,
also, real quick, that also feels like a group that you keep an extra guy or two just for pass rush upside. There's a lot of guys with pass rush upside there. Maybe you keep 9 and then you take some from another position. Because one of the things I know about Dan just from playing for him is that and again, a lot of coaches feel this way, you really value pass rush potential. And so maybe you say, hey man, we're not 100% sure. Let's keep this guy in the program, see if he develops. If he doesn't, we move on, midway through the year or whatever it is. So I think that's another thing to keep an eye on with that group specifically.
Yeah. Linebacker feels like maybe the most easy to break down position because it's just been so de-emphasized and they use so many options. Now, who's going to line up in the box is a very different conversation, because now you're talking about all these Buffalo nickel type of players. But the linebackers themselves, Luvu, Wagner, Jamin, McGee, and then maybe one of these other guys, maybe an Anthony Pittman, maybe a Michael Walker, maybe a Keandre Jones if they're excellent special teams players. But those 4 are probably going to be your core guys. And then you hope to keep some other guys on practice squad in case of injuries, easy call-ups, et cetera, like that. But at the end of the day, like, you're probably going to see a little bit of base this year, personnel-wise, a lot of 2 linebacker stuff. And I think that's the more interesting conversation about linebacker, which is much more of a fall discussion about how they deploy these guys versus kind of this initial, like, what are they even, going to do in terms of, dividing up the reps in camp, whatever. Like, they're going to try a bunch of stuff and these guys will rotate through the different positions. And I guess, and it's an offshoot of the same discussion, but it's because the personnel seems much more decided. I feel like it's a little bit of a different version of it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like you're right. I think it's not an overly like complex group in terms of who's going to make the team. I think it's kind of clear cut to a certain extent, but I think the more compelling discussion there is utilization. And I think it kind of really coincides nicely or leads in nicely to the secondary players. And I think that, again, much like the defensive line, it's like, what are they going to do with all these guys? And, we're talking linebackers now, but I'd probably put Jeremy Chin in that same bucket, not because he's a bad coverage player, but because of the flexibility that they utilized him with when he was at his peak in Carolina. So how does he affect that rotation? How does Quan affect that rotation? How does Sanders still affect that rotation? Like, you just all of a sudden have all of these kind of really compelling pieces that can play in that kind of mid-level of the defense. And I think when you look at Dallas over the last couple of years, like, they've done a great job of maximizing those guys. You know what I'm saying? Maximizing the middle level, playing multiple safety looks, getting in nickel, getting in dime. So, and like we talked about this on draft night, like, are they in dime more this year with Frankie Luvu kind of setting an edge? Is that something that they see a lot of value in? Because he does have that physicality and he's a great blitzer and he can play along the front. And when you look at how they used Anthony Barr and Kyle Van Noy, the kid from Boise State, I forget his
Leighton
name.
Vander Esch.
Yeah, Leighton Vander Esch. Like, they blitz him a lot. So maybe that's kind of what they end up doing. And I think about Curse there and what they did with him he's the Tampa player, he's a post safety. And from a body type standpoint, you've got a lot of guys that look like him on the roster. So that to me, defensively is, we talk about, offensively with Ben Sinnott and, all this stuff. That is the one that is the most kind of up in the air to me at the moment is you've got all these guys that are really good football players that have these kind of flexible skill sets. Ultimately, like, where do you settle? And I think the one thing is, like, you've got these good linebackers or this kind of established linebacker room, but how much are those guys going to even play? Because when you look at the dynamic coverage players, the more dynamic players in terms of ball skill production, it's in that kind of secondary group, I think, which is the thing that I find really, really interesting. And again, one of the things you can't wait to see is what is the initial plan for this group?
Yeah, no. And then it also comes down to, like, of all these safeties who can play linebacker, how many of them can play safety? And that's like another part of this is in Dallas, they had those guys too. Like, Malik Hooker had come over from Indy, and like, that's a dude that I remember, one of my favorite players in that draft that year, because he just had so much range. And like, who's that guy? Who's the post safety in Washington? I mean, Percy Butler, we know, has the speed, but Derek Forrest was the starter before he got hurt last year. Does Defoe have that kind of range? Or is he a little bit too big, not quite the fluid athlete? But like, does Butler have the anticipation where Defoe has that? We talk about that with like quarterbacks. There's guys with stronger arms than Jaden Daniels, but Jaden might get the ball there faster because he sees it and has a quick release and anticipates. Same is true as a defensive player. Like, can you anticipate and be in the right position to make your ground to cover less, as opposed to just having the speed to make up for your mental mistakes or you're mentally not being quite as sharp? So I don't know who I feel confident in as one post safety. Nevertheless, if we're playing, some too high shell type of stuff, if I'm Dan Quinn and Joe Witt Jr., like, who are the guys that are playing deep? And that gets into the Quan Martin question. Like, Quan can play that Buffalo role. He's strong in the box. He made a bunch of plays last year. We know he's super physical, but I'd probably rather have Jeremy Chin there, who's even bigger and more physical, and also probably less adept in space potentially. So I just think that's like, outside corner is its whole own beast, and we can talk about that in a second and should. But between Butler, Forrest, Chin, Martin, eventually you'd hope Dominique Hampton enters that, although he's probably more of a special teams guy in year one. Revo's still around. He's probably more of a special teams guy, but like has played some of that in the past. It's a very versatile group. My question is, how good are they? And that's something that's obviously going to take time and creativity and deployment and coaching and all those things to figure out.
Yeah, and again, when you look at guys that can move around in terms of like the archetype post safety, you kind of probably looking at a guy like Percy. But you mentioned, there was some youth there, and again, I'm very optimistic this year that the coaching improvement is going to lead to a much different production level for those guys. Because I think when you watch them, they play hard, they play physical, like all the things you want to do. But like we, as a staff and as a community surrounding these guys, we just need to be more specific about what our expectations are. And talking with guys, like the expectations weren't always very clear. And I think, one of the things about Dan, like having played for him, he's very clear about that, and I think that's something that's going to help these young guys develop. And all of a sudden, this group that is, you kind of feel tepid about in terms of production last year, coupled with guys coming in, it's like there's some big names in there, but the production wasn't very good across the board for those guys last year. You know what I'm saying? Outside of Quan Martin. And then you say, well, we get the coaching.
And even Quan, it was the second half of the year thing. Like, Quan struggled early. Like, people were like, oh my God, is this guy a total bust? And we're all just kind of like, if they could teach him one position instead of 4, maybe he'd be better. And they pared it down and found a role for him, and it really worked and it clicked for him because he's a smart kid who works his ass off. Yeah. And watching him develop was really fun last year. One of the few fun things about last year, frankly.
Right. Yeah, but I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's like, can we, again, find what Dan is always saying this, and I appreciate the hell of it. What is the guy's superpower, and how do we maximize it? Because you do have guys in that secondary with superpowers, right? Percy Butler is crazy fast. Quan's crazy physical, crazy smart, crazy football IQ. Forrest, right? Like the physicality and the kind of football IQ that he plays with, tremendously high. Jeremy Chin, the ability to take on a pulling guard and be physical and, get after people. Like, it's all there. And we haven't even talked about Mike Sanders still and what he brings from a ball production standpoint. Like, they've got pieces. And so I'm just trusting with this group. I'm trusting in the defensive staff here to say that we can maximize these guys and communicate to these guys and find the starting 5, basically, because that's what it's going to come down to. 5 guys we feel really, really good about playing a lot of football. And you mentioned Dominique Hampton. There's another guy that I really think could be a dark horse to carve out a role in the defense before it's all said and done. So, again, where it sounds like we're probably throwing spaghetti at a wall here, and we are to a certain extent because there are so many unknowns, and because I think much like the offense with the quarterback position, like what does the defense actually look like? And I think that's going to be a really compelling process because they're going to say, here's some pieces we can kind of add on and use, and do they fill those roles we envision them filling? So the whole process can be very interesting.
Yeah, so the thesis question, if you will, is like, what did the roster teach us, or what did the draft teach us about the roster? If there's one thing that we did learn, on top of some of the, kind of same thing with Jahan and Terry at the receiver position being with the McCaffrey pick, definitely that I think BSJ is playing outside. I think the BSJ in the slot experiment is over with the drafting of Mike Sainer still. And now the question is, can he play outside? Very mixed results 2 years ago. Very, very good. Last year, very, very not good. We know that the coaching struggles were immense, especially after Chris Harris Jr. left. And he is so intriguing because he is exactly half of what Dan Quinn dreams about and Joe Witt Jr. dreams about. He is long, he is physical, he has no ball skills, or has yet to show any ball skills. Right. So can they develop those ball skills? And if so, it feels like he's a starter opposite Emmanuel Forbes. And assuming that Forbes is able to maintain his role as a former first rounder just last year with all the ball skills, even though he's not the most physical guy in the world. But they also bring in Michael Davis from LA, who's had some nice ball production in his career and has like been a starting corner. So it feels like they've got some options here. I mean, Christian Holmes also talked about like a big physical corner. Obviously, it was a 7th round pick, and there was a reason why, but has shown some promise at times, also been way too handsy and picked up a ton of flags at other times. But yeah, they've got some options out there. And this is one of those where you're just, if you're a Commanders fan, I think relying on the fact that the coaching is going to make these guys a whole lot better. Because if not, they are real thin at outside corner in terms of quality.
And again, we talked about Quan playing inside. He played outside in college too. So maybe that's where it's like, and
I do wonder about that.
And part of the thing that's so fun about this group is because of the flexibility. Like, I mean, I don't want to say the possibilities are endless, but like it has to kind of be endless for them. And I know they probably have visions for every single player and the roles they're going to be in, but golly, man, they're going to have a lot of work to do. And it's compounded by the fact that they don't play. I don't want to say they don't play a traditional defense because it is a traditional defense now in the NFL with a lot more defensive backs on the field. And so it's about finding those 4 or 5 guys inside, outside that you feel comfortable about designating their roles for. And so I think that's going to be a lot of fun to kind of keep an eye on, over the course of the next couple of weeks. But yeah, man, like this defensively, like we talked about Newton and the linebacker, whatever, like this group and how they come together is the story for me for the offseason for this team. Like offensively, there's its own separate thing with the quarterback development, but even on offense,
but they're related too, right? Like there's Orlovsky said this on the pivot the other day. Ryan Clark was like, "What's the best thing you can give a young quarterback?" And Dan's like, "Forget a running game, give me a defense."
Yeah.
Like if Jaden Daniels has to go out there and be like, "I got to score 17 points today and we win the football game," he's gonna be able to play with a mental freedom and a lack of stress that is very different than what we saw him even last year at LSU. Like he had to score 50 points a game at LSU. Right. Imagine what he can do when he's only got to score 17. And obviously that would mean the Commanders' defense is great, but like the idea of the pressure being down has an impact on Jaden Daniels' development. So how this group comes together is essential even for that. Nevertheless, what it means in a vacuum.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this already, but offense, it feels very clear cut outside of the left side of the offensive line where it's got to develop. Here, like this feels totally up in the air. The more you talk about it, the more you think about it, the more you think about skill sets. And so in terms of like, if you're a fan, like this is something that is, I want to say going to make or break the season, but it's going to be extremely impactful on the success of this team. You mentioned the defense and how that insulates the young quarterback, but yeah, like they've definitely got their work cut out for them. And it's good because they've got some talented guys, just about how it all comes together.
No doubt. All right. We are scheduled to talk to Trevor Sikkema from Pro Football Focus for our second podcast this week. So make sure you're subscribed to get that. Should hit your feeds on Thursday morning. It'll be a lot of fun to talk to Trevor. We'll have to see where he's set up, Logan. He just moved to a new place, so hopefully he's got his full setup going. I'm sure he's got it. He's a big fancy TV guy now. He does NFL Network, the whole thing. If I was him, as soon as I moved in, getting the studio set up would have been a priority. But we'll talk to Trevor coming up later this week. And other than that, we're in full off-season mode, so it's going to be fun to watch and track this stuff.
So leave your suggestions.
OTAs.
Leave suggestions for shows. We're 100% on board. Comment, like, whatever. Leave suggestions for shows.
Likes won't help us with suggestions. They will help us with other things. I'm saying
I don't care about that. I need suggestions for shows. So come through, guys. Okay. Instagram, YouTube, wherever.
I do care about your likes. Also, hit like. It takes half a second, and then leave us a suggestion for the show. You can also, again, hit us Instagram, Twitter, whatever. What would you like us to do? What would you like us to talk about? Fun, silly ideas. We ever do the bigs versus smalls football game idea?
We never did that. We should probably do that now. That would be a good time for that.
Yeah. So we'll do that. And obviously we'll be tracking all the stuff we just talked about in terms of the positional usages and all this stuff as training camp starts and as the OTA period starts here in just a couple of weeks. Rookie midding camp coming up before we know it very, very soon. Also try to get some player interviews on the show, something that has been really fun for us to do in the off season. So stay tuned for that. And by stay tuned, I mean subscribe. Subscribe wherever you are watching or listening right now. And we'll see you next time on Take Command. Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command, which has a brand new home.
That's right. You can watch on YouTube at the Team 980.
You can also listen to full episodes in the free Odyssey app, which is now enabled with Apple CarPlay. So we'll just, follow you around.